And a cruise missile, a nuclear cruise missile that can only fly at 500 miles an hour, is very easy to shoot down. Despite the fact that Putin says this thing can fly for hours, if not days, the aim of it is to attack the United States. It would take well over 10 hours to get to the United States. And we know from United States air defense capability, it would most likely be shot down. At the same time, the Russians also talked about their battle-winning maritime underwater drone or torpedo called the Poseidon, which they say they've tested and could create tsunamis to flatten US cities on the eastern and western coast. It did make President Trump comment most forcefully, and he reminded President Putin that his most powerful American submarine with enough intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles to flatten the whole of Russia was just off the coast of Russia.
Hamish, the Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel, former commander of NATO's and UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Massive explosions hit Russia's Saratov region overnight, striking an oil refinery near Angol's base, 500 miles from the Ukrainian border. On Sunday, Ukrainian drones struck Russia's Black Sea oil terminal in Tuapse. Also on Friday, Ukrainian intelligence blew up key Russia's oil pipeline in the Moscow regions, knocking out power in this area. Is Vladimir Putin losing control of his own war?
Well, certainly there is a lot of pressure coming on the Russians. And I think what we call these deep strategic strikes that Ukraine is managing to do are, and we've been discussing this now for many months, it's having a significant impact. It would appear that, maybe 30 or more percent of Russia's oil industry and ability to make petrol fuel for cars has been destroyed by these deep strikes. And petrol is in short supply now in Russia, and if you can get it, it's very expensive. The rank and file civilian population of Russia are now realizing that the state, Putin, cannot protect them. And with the power going out recently and overnight in Moscow, this is again something else that Putin and the Kremlin cannot hide from the Russian people. And the key thing about the oil industry, it's where President Putin gets most of the currency, foreign currency and money to keep his war machine going. And it's very clear now that that is having a severe impact. And a lot of these attacks are by Ukrainian indigenous, self-made drones and missiles that are having a huge impact. We've talked a lot about the possibility of Ukraine getting Tomahawk cruise missiles, which make a difference. Well, actually, it's pretty clear that Ukraine is developing its own missiles that are just as effective. So all of these, it's sort of the quote, a death by 1,000 cuts are actually really beginning to have an impact. And we've seen some protests in St. Petersburg and elsewhere across Russia from people now beginning to openly oppose the Russian regime. And that must be a good thing. I think the critical thing that we in the West must do, and particularly the Americans, is keep up the supply of munitions. We understand the Germans have just given more Patriot batteries, which will be very useful because Russia is still attacking civilian targets in Ukraine. And of course, ultimately, if the Americans release the Tomahawk missiles, which President Trump seems to be still thinking about, then that really could pave a way for massive gains. And at the end of it, I think everybody just wants President Putin to come to the negotiation table. And it seems the most likely thing to do it is to cut off his supply of money and cut off the power in Russia. That seems to be the most likely way at the moment.
You just mentioned about protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg recently. According to publication by New York Times and The Telegraph, Russia's FSB security Saratov has accused Mr. Khodorkovsky and members of anti-war committee based in London of plotting a coup against Vladimir Putin's regime. They also have accused this group of opposing Russia's war against Ukraine and also planning a capture of power and overthrow of the order in the Russian Federation. Don't you think that Vladimir Putin is closer to such scenario than ever because he decides to continue this war?
Well, it's particularly difficult for us here in the UK to understand, what is happening in Russia and how the Russian Federation works. But you only have to look at history of the Soviet Union and more recently the Russian Federation, of how their leaders remain in power and how they do business. It's very different to the sort of democracy that we have in the UK and you have in Ukraine. Unfortunately, when you have a tyrant like Putin running things and he has his sort of henchmen around him, any opposition is not back. So it's not surprising that there is opposition, particularly the opposition, the exiled opposition, Russian opposition outside in Europe and UK and places like that, who are really drumming up support and talking truth to power, if you like. And however much the Russian Federation, the Kremlin, tries to control what information gets into Russia, although they can switch off the internet whenever they like, the real story does seem to be getting around Russia and to the rank and file. And people are now realizing quite what is happening. So, yeah, I think Putin is realizing he's getting in a precarious position. And what would appear at the moment, he's saying that, if he did start to negotiate for peace, that would be the end of him, because his aims that he's been saying for many years now, and really when he started his special military operation on the 24th of February 2022, well over 3.5 years ago, was the complete subjugation of Ukraine and then onwards to redraw the old Soviet boundaries. Now he's very, very far from that, and he knows better than anybody that Russian dictators who fail very rarely live much longer. So I think Putin is probably now really worried about his own skin more than anything else, and perhaps sees the only way to keep going is by keep fighting this illegal war in Ukraine. But hopefully people in Russia are now realizing the full extent of what is happening, and the full extent of casualties, well over 1 million Russian casualties so far, and rising by the day. So yeah, it would appear things are getting really challenging in the Kremlin, and let's hope there are enough sensible heads there to force Putin either out or to come to the peace negotiation table, because ultimately the world desires a just peace for Ukraine, and the only person opposing it at the moment is President Putin and his close supporters.
But if Vladimir Putin can't end this war against Ukraine because he can lose power, he could lose his power, his grip on power, how could the war in Ukraine finally end from your perspective, if Putin cannot simply accept a grievous ceasefire deal due to his fear of losing power in Russia?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. The West must step up its support to Ukraine. We must give Ukraine absolutely everything it needs to prevail, to convince. If Putin can't be convinced, then those around him. And I think it's no secret that there are hawks in the Kremlin. There are people around Putin waiting to step in and to take power. And I suppose we're not bothered who runs the Russian Federation. We're all bothered on a just peace for Ukraine. So I think stepping up our support, hopefully the Russians are seeing what's happening in Europe at the moment. The Germans are spending more on defense and building the biggest military that they've really had since the Second World War. And that must be a very powerful message to the Russians that at least the Germans are going to no longer appease them. But I think, Trump probably holds the major card in all of this. And if Trump decides that Tomahawk missiles, and not just one or two, hundreds of them, are given to Ukraine, then that might be the sort of what we call, the final straw that breaks the Russians' camel's back, as it were. But ultimately, it is a unified West absolutely backing Ukraine to the hilt, so that the Russians realize that there is no hope of victory in any measure at all. And hopefully the rank and file, the normal people in Russia, will realize that thousands of their young men are dying every day just to satisfy Putin's ego. So ultimately, it's up to the West to keep supporting Ukraine in order that Ukraine can prevail, and the Russian people will realize the only way forward is peace.
It is also interesting that recently Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, who recently visited the US, he said that the war in Ukraine would end within 1 year by a peaceful settlement, according to reported by Reuters. Isn't he too positive? What is your reaction to such a prediction statement from Putin's inner circle?
Well, I think we've learned over the last 3.5 years or longer to really be very circumspect with what the Russians are saying. And no doubt this delegation and Putin's spokesman going to the US is saying things that he probably thinks that President Trump wants to hear. And the fact that he's saying this war will end in a year, well, I mean, that's pretty meaningless, really. I mean, there are no caveats on or no sort of ways and means exactly how the Russians are going to end this war. When you realize that the Russian aim is the complete subjugation of Ukraine. So is he saying that Russia is going to defeat Ukraine in the next 12 months? Well, that seems very, very unlikely. In fact, Russia is losing ground rather than gaining it. So I think it is more to the Russians are trying to appease Trump, trying to persuade Trump that he doesn't really need to do anything more than he's doing at the moment. Because we saw only a few weeks ago, and we discussed it a few weeks ago, the panic in the Kremlin when it was thought that hundreds of US Tomahawk cruise missiles were going to come into the possession of the Ukrainian military, and that made the Russians completely go off track. So I think this is just part of it. Unfortunately, I don't really take very much of what this man says to be near the truth. I think it's just for public consumption back in Russia that Putin is talking to Trump, or through his negotiator. But his words, I think, are pretty meaningless at the moment.
Let's also cover current situation on the ground and in Pokrovsk. Ukrainian military intelligence forces landed in Pokrovsk earlier this week in a daring operation overseen personally by General Kirill Budanov. Troops arrived by a Black Hawk helicopter and targeted areas that Russia claims to hold in Pokrovsk. What is your assessment of this special operation and current situation and current battle for Pokrovsk?
Well, I think, as we've discussed for many months, the fighting in that area have been very, very intense. The Russians apparently have put 170,000 troops into this area, and the Ukrainian forces have fought heroically to bash down this counteroffensive. And as you said, the head of security, Banov, has been in the area over the weekend directing special forces operations, which have been widely shown on the internet and elsewhere, and looking to be successful. These sort of precision strikes by elite forces like this can have a strategic impact. And despite the fact that Russian media is talking about the fall of this area, many thousands of Ukrainian troops, this again is just Russian propaganda and disinformation. But actually, what we're really learning is that the Russian soldiers are being held. They are being killed in there many thousands. And it would be difficult to see if Russia could get together a force like this again. This was this was their ace card, they thought, to be able to take this area, because this defensive belt, if they can break through here, it would have a strategic impact and open the road to Kyiv. But the fact that Ukrainian special forces and head of Ukraine security is in the area directing operations seems to be a smart move to me militarily, and this seems to be the sort of last throw of the dice, I think, from the Russians, and they will, I think they'll have a great difficulty recovering from this. But we need to obviously watch this very closely. This is where the really hard fighting has happened, and at the moment it looks as though Ukraine still has the upper hand.
If Russia captures the city of Pokrovsk, how will this influence the outcome of this war from a strategic point of view?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, it is a key area, and if they do break through in this area, then it makes the possibility, if they had the ability to reinforce with more thousands of soldiers and tanks and aircraft, then they could make inroads. But I think the assessments that we're seeing out of the US and elsewhere are that this is very unlikely. And the fact that they put so much effort into it, in military terms, we would say they've reached their culminating point. In other words, their military has run out of steam, and they'll find it very difficult to do anything else. It may well be that this might precipitate some sort of peace negotiation. We shall see. Let's hope that particularly the Americans and NATO are looking at this very closely and see this as an opportunity to reinforce Ukraine military, to keep them on the front foot, because ultimately all this is designed to bring Putin to the negotiation table. But very difficult times, and certainly what we're hearing about the fighting in this area is the most intense and most challenging that I think we've seen for some time.
Let's cover also recent Russia's nuclear drills and also introduction of Vladimir Putin new capability, a nuclear-powered Burevestnik missile with so-called unlimited range. What is your assessment of this? Putin says this missile can fly for months and avoid all world's air defense assets.
Well, I've written extensively about this in the UK Daily Telegraph, and I think this is a sign of desperation. There's been a lot of nuclear talk over the last 7 days. We talk about the missile that you mentioned here, this cruise missile, dubbed the Chernobyl dustbin. It's nuclear powered, which is bizarre. If you think a Tomahawk missile is less than $1 million, these missiles probably $10, $20, $30 million, so incredibly expensive. And we know that Russia is running out of money. And a cruise missile, a nuclear cruise missile that can only fly at 500 miles an hour, is very easy to shoot down. Despite the fact that Putin says this thing can fly for hours, if not days, the aim of it is to attack the United States. It would take well over 10 hours to get to the United States. And we know from United States air defense capability, it would most likely be shot down. At the same time, the Russians also talked about their battle-winning maritime underwater drone or torpedo called the Poseidon, which they say they've tested and could create tsunamis to flatten US cities on the eastern and western coast. It did make President Trump comment most forcefully, and he reminded President Putin that his most powerful American submarine with enough intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles to flatten the whole of Russia was just off the coast of Russia. So I think this is pretty desperate nuclear rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin. But actually, if you unpick the detail and look at it, it's incongruous. For the last couple of years, the Russians are saying the only missiles that can have an impact on the battlefield are hypersonic missiles. These are missiles traveling at Mach 3 or 4, 4 or 5,000 miles per hour. And then suddenly Russia decides, no, you want a really slow missile. So I think this is all part of the propaganda and disinformation that we've become so used to in Russia. And actually, I think strategically, Putin and the Russians have made a big mistake here, because they've been trying to be friendly to Trump and trying to get him to see their way, but it's really annoyed Trump. Trump has been pretty vitriolic and pretty angry with Putin in the last week, telling him to stop fighting and reminding him that the USA has far more and better nuclear weapons than Russia does. And rather than shouting about Russian nuclear weapons, Putin needs to come to the peace negotiation table. So I think a lot of disinformation and propaganda, and I think yet another strategic mistake by Putin.
You just also mentioned about these hypersonic missiles, which were also presented earlier by Vladimir Putin as a possible game changer. However, US made Patriot anti-aircraft systems. US Patriots have successfully shut down such Angol missiles in Ukraine. These systems were operated by Ukrainian forces in Ukraine. Putin, however, presented this missile as unstoppable one. What is your take on that?
Well, I think you make a very good point there, Daniel, that, we've been hearing about these unstoppable Russian hypersonic missiles. And as far as we're aware, the Ukrainians have pretty much shot them all down with US Patriot missiles. And we also hear that Ukraine's getting a load more Patriot missile batteries. So, I think this is a real own goal for Putin. If you are going to use bravado to try and get advantage, you need to make sure that bravado has substance to it. But we're beginning to learn that actually the Russian hypersonic missiles, they might go very fast, but they also get shot down very fast too. And we've seen that the US air defense capabilities are way, way superior to the Russians. We've talked before about the American attack on the Iranian nuclear program earlier on this year, where American stealth jets went and attacked untouched from Russian air defense and Russian fighters. So it is pretty clear that Western military technology at the moment is far superior to Russian. And each time they try and come up with some battlefield winning weapon, it's very easy to realize that is just not the case. I mean, the example I always use, and others use as well, how many Russian cars do people drive around in the West? I think absolutely none. But what do the oligarchs choose in Russia? They choose German BMWs, Mercedes, and British Aston Martins and Rolls Royces. And that's just an example of the difference in the level of technology between the East and the West. So let's hope this is desperation coming out of the Kremlin, and they will realize that actually, when it comes to military capability, they are no match for Western technology, which is why, as we said at the very beginning, it's essential that the West gives Ukraine all it needs to ensure that Putin comes to the peace negotiation table.
Let's also cover our final topic, US Tomahawk missile. We have new reporting here. Pentagon has given White House the green light to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missile after assessing that it would not impact US stockpiles, leaving final decision in President Trump's hands, according to recent reporting by CNN. What is your take on that, and does this bring us closer to receiving Tomahawk missiles?
Well, I think it's very interesting, as we spoke earlier, that Putin's envoy was in the States last week, and I think it's directly because of these Tomahawk missiles. And as you said, the Pentagon have given the green light. I think there was a concern, and a concern perhaps coming out of the US political administration, that the Americans didn't have enough Tomahawk missiles. But it would appear that they have many, many thousands. And what the Pentagon seem to be saying is if Trump wants to give a few hundred or more to Ukraine, that wouldn't ultimately affect the US defensive capabilities. So I think that is a big hurdle that has been got over. And if Putin continues to ignore Trump's calls to come to the peace negotiation table, it strikes me it's a very easy decision for Trump now to allow Tomahawks to be used in support of Ukraine, because ultimately I think everybody would be aware that it would still need an amount of US support in order to get Tomahawks launched into Russia. But those issues seem to have been concluded now. So really it would appear it is just up to President Trump to say yes or no. And he has indicated that he is more likely to say yes now than perhaps in the past. And let's hope he does, because I personally believe, and we've discussed many times, that that is the most likely impact that would get Putin to negotiate, probably more than anything else.
However, President Trump made a new statement on Tomahawk this night. He said that he was not really considering providing Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles at this stage. From your perspective, why does President Trump hesitate to do so? And is he really giving Vladimir Putin last chance to negotiate, to sit at the negotiating table and end the war before providing Ukraine with more deadly cruise missiles?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what Trump is doing. He doesn't really want to give all his cruise missiles, but he knows that it could make a difference. And of course, President Trump is focusing elsewhere as well at the moment. There is his spat with the Venezuelans at the moment, and a whole host of other issues too. So he's come triumphant back from his trip to the Far East recently, and he seems to have done a deal with the Chinese and others. So he's feeling pretty buoyant at the moment. And I expect he's hoping that Putin will negotiate without having to give away Tomahawks. But I don't think it's that far away. I think your assertion that Trump is just giving Putin a bit more time to think about it is probably right. But I would be very surprised that if Putin does not listen to Trump about stopping the war pretty soon, I think Trump will run out of patience, and I expect those Tomahawks will be bound towards Ukraine.
Also, we haven't discussed this earlier, but US imposed sanctions against two of Russia's biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, and President Zelensky says that these sanctions would cost Russia $50 billion next year. Also, Ukrainian presidential office has estimated that if the sanctions are properly enforced by US, then this would cost Russia up to $100 billion next year. Can Vladimir Putin sustain such economic losses if he just continues to buy new missile and continues to direct to produce so-called unstoppable Burevestnik nuclear-powered missile?
Well, you wouldn't have thought so. And I think when you also realize that both the Indian government and the Chinese government have said they're not going to buy Russian oil for the moment, that is another blow. Now, anywhere else in the world, you would say, yeah, this is unsustainable for the Russians. They are going to have to come to the negotiation table. However, you have to consider, Putin and the Kremlin's view. They don't seem to care much for the rank and file, the people of Russia. Despite the fact that they can't get fuel, everything is very expensive, and thousands of people are starving. That doesn't seem to worry Putin and the Kremlin. So any normal country, you would expect, yeah, this would bring them to the knees and is unsurvivable. But of course, when you've got President Putin involved, that is just not the case. And the Russians were trumpeting only over the weekend that their gold reserves were worth $700 billion, and they could just spend that. But let us hope that actually, people in Russia are realizing what's happening, and with the threat of Tomahawks potentially heading towards Ukraine, this might be enough to make Putin realize that all his ambitions for his special military operation are over, and the best he can hope for is a peace deal now, rather than lose absolutely everything he thinks he's gained over the next year or so.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me, and glory to Ukraine.